Welcome, Ross Douthat, to the Sphere podcast. Um,
Thank you, Pascal. It is a great plaisir, as they say in your part of the world, to be avec you.
may
I'm
we,
going to
may
do this
we?
whole thing in pidgin French.
Yes,
That's
yes,
my
we're going
goal.
to do it in Franglish. Um, no, this is it's great to have you. It's great to talk to you. You and I have known each other for a very long time. You are one of the smartest people I know. This is a
I,
great moment for fans of Renee Zellweger everywhere. Um, for those who don't know, Ross is a columnist at the New York Times, and he has a very, very difficult job of being the only real conservative at the New York Times. And
who's to say? People always say that, and there's I certainly many readers of the New York Times consider some of my colleagues to be real conservatives as well. So
yeah,
I
yes,
think I
yes.
think I think and what is honestly in this Trumpian age, what is real conservatism anyway, Pascal?
Well,
I think that's
thank you
itself
for bringing up
an
our
open
first
question.
topic, which is that this crazy orange guy got elected president. He got elected president in a decisive fashion with a multiracial working class coalition of sort of traditional conservatives, but also new voters. And this is interesting and relevant because many, many, many years ago, you and Raihan Salam wrote first an article and then a book arguing that the natural base of the Republican Party was working class voters and not, it turns out, private equity billionaires, that they're not actually 51% of the country. And therefore, the party should cater more to them and less to the other. So, do those results make you feel vindicated? Are you crying
Com-
victory? Are you
Completely in every respect. This is exactly how we envisioned
Yes,
it
it's
happening.
exactly how you
It's
planned it.
precisely. No, I actually, Raihan, my co-author, and I, we recorded a podcast for the New York Times itself, talking over sort of how our vision has been vindicated and
Yes, they
hasn't been
got your first
vindicated
draft, but now I get the
in
better
different way.
version.
You can get the better version, right? We worked it out. Well, you can just get my take. I was sort of trying to coax a strong take out of Raihan.
Which
But
is
no,
always
I think we were completely correct in terms of what the foundation of the 21st century right was going to be. I think we were correct in ways that have applications in the United States and Europe as well. The general trajectory of a kind of the emergence of a kind of blue collar right and a kind of Brahmin left is one of the fundamental realities that both political parties in the U.S., multiple political parties in your beloved France, have to cope with. And so that part we completely saw coming. I would say not just sort of Trump himself, which obviously we didn't see coming. When I talked to Raihan about this, we talked a little bit about sort of our try. We spent some time 15 years ago, 20 years ago, whenever this started, trying to imagine the ideal figure. But at no point did we say the ideal figure is going to be Donald J. Trump, which was our failure, right? I think
he
there are
was
certain
already famous. He was already very
he
famous.
was already famous, and there were various ways in which he turned out to be, precisely the right fit for this
Yeah.
moment. But I think part
What
of
did you
why
think
we
populism meant? Was it vibes, essays?
that's right. We thought it meant policy proposals, Pascal. We thought it meant white papers. I mean, we did, right? I mean, that was the thing, right? I grew up in the 1990s, a child of Bill Clinton's America, and the interesting thing about Bill Clinton, looking back, was that he was, in his own way, a populist, sort of the last guy who was able to keep working
Yeah,
class, lower
it's
middle
true.
class America in the Democratic tent.
It's true.
And the way he did it was a mix of vibes, schmoozing, I feel your pain sentimentality, and policy. He was really good at making those things
True.
fit together to say, here's why the Republican Party's out to take your Medicare. I feel your pain. Right? I mean, that was his. He
Yeah.
could give. He gave the speech he gave for Barack Obama's 2012 renomination was this kind of masterpiece of moving in and out of sort of rhetorical appeals and actually using policy detail to sort of fillet the Romney Ryan
I mean,
ticket. So that was
he's the greatest politician of my lifetime in any country that I know at explaining public policy to the average person.
right. So that was what we were looking for. We said, look, the Republican Party, one, it needs more of an agenda for its actual voters, right? It can't just be the party of supply side tax cuts now and forever, world without end. Amen. It needs policies that are actually suited to some of the problems created by family breakdown, deindustrialization, all of these things. We were always occupying an odd place where we were arguing against the libertarian right, who said everything is great economically for the working class,
Yep.
but also against the economic left, who said everything is terrible. Our
Right.
position was everything is, a little bit mediocre, stagnant, and could be improved. Right, that was sort of our view. Um, and so, yeah, so we had sort of a sketch of what that agenda should be, and we were looking for a politician who could speak for it. And I think in certain ways you could say that J.D. Vance, the vice president elect of the United States, is close to the kind of politician we were looking
Never
for.
heard of
And
him.
you haven't, yeah. I mean, he was a Marine. He wrote a book that some people read at some point, and was active on social media for a while. So those are all places you can look him up. But I think if you
Okay, I
watched
will.
his performance in the vice presidential debate with
Yes. Yes.
Tim Walz,
Joking aside, yes, he
that
had
that was
that
what
sort of, yeah.
that was what the grand new party
Yeah.
vision was about. You get someone who has working class credibility, a sort of blue collar background, who has is capable of you know operating among the elites but also critiquing them, who can stand up and say, here's what we're going to do about family policy, here's how it fits in with
Right.
your challenges, middle America. Obviously, that's not really what Donald Trump and I do think I was a never Trumper. I was very anti-Trump in 2016, and my view in 2016 was that he was speaking to all of the anxieties and concerns that Ryan and I were talking about, but he was doing it in a toxic, polarizing way that was both sort of bad in and of itself, but also couldn't possibly build a majority for the Republican Party. And even though he won in 2016, I think that analysis sort of made sense of that victory, right? His victory was he didn't win a majority of votes. He maxed out Republican support among the white working class, but didn't make big inroads then among minority voters. He was sort of perceived as a candidate of white identity politics, and obviously he had strong economic appeals as well. But there was that quality, like this is the guy who's speaking to the white part of the middle and working class. But 8 years later, things look different. He has not a sweeping majority, but he has the kind of multiracial working class majority that we envisioned. And so, toxic or not, you have to credit him with that success.
Yeah. I mean,
even
so
though even though he doesn't even though he doesn't really want to talk about family friendly tax policy or what whatever else. I mean, what he wants, like, look, part of the lesson of 2016 that I tried to take to heart, at least, right, was that there's a lot of voters in America, not just America, there's a lot of people who don't want to be told, here's this sort of complex policy add-on to the existing policy landscape that will boost your take-home pay by $2,000 a year and therefore make it easier for you to raise your kid. People
Yeah.
would rather hear American factories are going to be open again. America is going to boom again. We sold out our industrial base to China. We're going to bring it back. Like, people want that kind of sweeping, dramatic story. And that was a big part of Trump's success relative to the kind of reform conservative,
Right.
wonk driven alternative.
Yeah. I mean, so that's, looking back over the whole, and I was talking about this with someone recently. Like, somebody someday should do a history of the reform,
No, no,
a book
no.
for
False.
5 people to read.
Incorrect.
Uh, but looking back on this, I mean, I having been sort of a marginal part of that world, I reflect. So, there was a kind of naivete, about the whole vibes papers questions. Like, we fantasized about guys like Mitch Daniels and Bobby Jindal, which, with all due respect, we're not gonna put aside Trump. They were not Nixon either, if you know what I mean, or Reagan's, and we sort of didn't realize that populism had to be populist.
Yeah, I mean, I think in defense of the project, right? For instance, I never thought that Jeb. I mean, one, there was just the populist vision in after George W. Bush's administration fell apart. It just naturally fell on hard times, right? Because George W. Bush, for all his faults, was trying to do something in the kind of populist space. That was what compassionate conservatism and the ownership society, all those things were all about. It was like, how do you do conservatism, but for the middle and working class? And it
Yes.
didn't. It didn't work. It ended in a housing bubble. It flopped. And so then you had this period where Republicans were just returning to basics. We're
Yes.
just cutting government. We're anti-Obama. We have no affirmative message. And that was the time when it was like, oh, well, Mitch Daniels, at least he sounds smart, at least he knows how to run the government, right? Like that kind of thing. There just wasn't a lot there. By the time you got to 2014, 15, and so on, I don't think, I think you, like, I certainly was under no illusions that Jeb Bush was the ideal tribune, right, for a more populist conservatism. Some of us probably put more stock in Marco Rubio because he was a more gifted rhetorician and had a better personal story. But I don't look back on that era and say, oh, we were sort of convinced that we had the perfect candidate. I wasn't like wildly optimistic about the future of conservative policymaking, I don't think, in 2014 or so. Um, but I still didn't expect the Trumpian eruption.
Neither did I. Okay, so given everything we've just talked about, given the sort of this emerging coalition, let's not call it emerging majority yet, but emerging coalition, given who Trump is, given the direction of his cabinet, which seems to be sort of balanced between the various wings of the party. Like, what's next? What can we expect from Trump 2.0?
Well, I think one theory is that um, relative to where we were 10 or 15 years ago, a couple of things have happened that have actually made it easier for the Republican Party to hold together both its sort of new voters, its multiracial working class voters, and parts of um, parts of the old country club. It's not, nobody belongs to a country club anymore, but we'll call them country club Republicans for want of a better
Well, because
word,
you
right?
can't keep women out anymore, so it's what's the point?
That's right. Absolutely. That is the key issue. Um, I think I think part of it is that the original Republican coalition, the Ronald Reagan, Richard Nixon coalition, right, was created in part by failures of liberal governance in the 60s and 70s, issues of crime, urban decline, inflation, all of these things, right? And when in thinking about populism and a new conservatism 10 or 15 years ago, those issues all seemed relatively distant. America's cities were gentrifying, crime was not as low as it could be, but relatively low. Inflation was a distant memory. And of course, the period events of the last, let's say, 6 years have brought all of those 1970s era issues back. And so, in a certain way, that's just made the Republican Party's job easier. It doesn't necessarily have to craft some perfectly visionary agenda in order to get a lot of votes. It can just say, look at what the liberals have done again, right? So it has that going for it. There's certain ways in which it's just easier to run as a Republican in 2024 than it was to run as a Republican in 2012. So that change, we'll see how long the Democrats continue being trapped in their own world of activist litmus tests and misgoverned blue states and blue cities. But that's a reality that's different than it
Right.
was a little while ago. In terms of affirmative policy, I think it's really, really unclear the what the Trump era Republican Party wants to actually do. It's clear who it wants to represent, right? It wants to be representative of a larger group of people than the Romney-Ryan Republican Party. And that's how you have, for instance, the Trump cabinet, right? It
Yes.
doesn't just add diversity of various kinds by having Tulsi Gabbard and Robert F. Kennedy Jr. representing, I think we can call them sort of various views that were fringe in American politics, more
Yeah.
associated with the left, anti-war politics, sort of crunchy, holistic critiques of the medical establishment. Those are now inside the Republican tent in some strange way, right? But we don't know what that means yet. We don't know.
Yes.
There are things Robert F. Kennedy would like to do about public health that a libertarian Republican would hate and oppose, right? So it's unclear exactly how that cashes out. But similarly, on economic policy, you have a Republican Party that, on the one hand, is still very much the party that wants the stock market to go up. It wants to be, it's certainly not going to be raising taxes anytime soon. It wants to extend the original Trump tax cuts, which were, sort of creative in certain ways, but still more an extension of traditional Republican tax policy making than anything all that novel. But then, Trump picks for his labor secretary one of the most pro-labor Republicans in the House of Representatives, to howls from
Yep.
other parts of the right. Right. So he
Grover was
wants,
not happy.
yeah, he wants some kind of representation for Teamster Republicanism, whatever
Yeah.
that means,
Yeah.
right? And then he's got as his vice president, Vance, who, again, what Vanceism cashes out on specifically is unclear, but clearly it's substantially different from whatever Paul Ryan wanted to do in
Yes.
2016. But I just think it's really up for grabs. I think if you wanted to make a story, if you wanted to tell a optimistic story, and I'll probably write something about this at some point soon, but you would say, look, there is a sort of a new fusionism might be possible on the right that brings together basically the Vancian desire to sort of protect and uplift the working class in the American heartland with the Elon Muskian desire
Yeah.
to build big, deregulate, and go to Mars. Now,
Yeah.
so in an ideal world, you get a conservatism that fits those two things together somehow, that is more attuned to sort of maintaining an economic foundation underneath blue collar America, but also is not just trapped in a kind of populist nostalgia politics, right? Which is I think clearly a potential trap. You need the Muskian dynamism as well. But can those two things fit together perfectly? It's hard to say. If Musk's like project for government efficiency, it could be incredibly successful, or it could just be sort of like, you know, Tom Coburn, the Republican
Yeah.
senator from Oklahoma,
Ooh, they spent
listing like
$20,000 studying the sex life of raccoons.
right, like
Ooh.
let's make fun of 0.0001% of the federal budget and not actually do anything to reform the rest of it. So
Yep.
I think it's all very up in the air right now.
Yeah. Okay. So you have not one but two books coming out to just make every
Neither
one of us feel bad.
No, you don't need to feel bad, but neither of them are about domestic policy. Thank God.
Yes. So we had the requisite chat about domestic policy, but now I'm going to talk about what's actually interesting, which is your oeuvre. Okay, so let's start with the real book.
Wait, which is the real book?
Which is the
The
real
one
book?
that's being published between covers, right? Yes.
Yes,
Yes.
exactly.
Yes.
The one that my grandmother would call a real book.
Yes.
Um,
Yes. So I have a book coming out in February, which is relatively soon, that is called Believe: Why Everyone Should Be Religious. And it is essentially my attempt to do
well,
for
because
religion.
otherwise, Project 2025 will throw them in a prison camp.
That's right. It is actually the third chapter is called Building the Republic of Gilead. One step at a time. No, it's a book that my theory of our cultural moment is that there is a kind of opening for religious arguments in much the same way that there was a big opening for militant atheist arguments 20 years ago. And so I'm essentially trying to step into that opening with a book that is, in certain ways, it's my most liberal book, I think, in the sense that it takes a very open approach to religion. It's trying to offer very general forms of encouragement to the kind of people who sort of hover on the threshold of religious practice. And while it does end, the final chapter is about my own Christianity and makes a case for Christianity. It's not a sort of, Catholicism is the one true faith kind of book. It's much more
It's a
you should
generic deist
you
book.
should you should try to be religious. You should join one of the major world religions,
It's a
and
very American book,
it's
then.
very American in that sense, yes. And just making the attempt is worth a great deal in the eyes of God, even if you don't get everything right. So that's a liberal. I think that's kind of a liberal sentiment. Um, but it's also very, it
Going
will
back
be
to your
perceived
WASP
as.
roots, it's
Sorry,
going back to your WASP roots. It doesn't
that's
matter
right.
what you believe as
Going
long as you
back,
believe in
as
something.
long as you believe in something. It doesn't. No, it doesn't go that far. It has
Okay, I'm mucking you, but I mean, the Catholic Church rejects nothing that is true and holy in other religions. There's some it's not, from a Christian perspective, it's not wrong to say that every religion has some sort of I don't know if the right word is validity, but sort of wisdom. And so in that sense, I'm making jokes because that's what I always do, but um I'm not hostile to it. What I guess the question I'm groping towards is why is that the argument? Why did you choose to go with that argument rather than the sort of more be Catholic argument? Is it just publishing industry economics, or
No, I think it's partially the sense that part of the book, the initial claim of the book is a very strong one that I think a lot of people are not accustomed to. And by people, I don't mean our friends in traditional Catholicism, but normal people,
yeah,
who, I keep having
the
people
normies?
I keep having people say to me after they've seen something about the book, and they'll say something like, "Oh, this is a book about how you should just try practicing a faith, and then and in practicing it, you will discover the deeper truths of that faith, but you don't have to fully believe in God to start practicing the faith. So it's sort of the idea being it's a sort of religion is useful before it's true. And that's not what the book is doing. The book is saying that, in fact, there are certain basic but substantial features of the religious perspective on the world that you can assume are true before you start practicing a religion. And these don't extend all the way to the dogmas offered in the Catechism of the Catholic Church, but they do include things that, again, sort of normal people in the broad Western intelligentsia have a really hard time with, like not just, that God might exist, but that the supernatural is probably real, that, you people, there is almost certainly life after death. There are heavenly and hellish possibilities available, these kind of things, right? That I think
We're going to do the UFO podcast later.
the UFOs are really only a footnote in the book to people's disappointment. That will have to be the next book. I have to figure out what the UFOs are before I write the UFO book. I'd say
you should co-write it with Tucker Carlson. I would.
Yes. Well, if he figures it out, then we can
You could
do
no,
that.
okay. So you should go together on a road trip to try to figure out and film yourselves as you're doing so, and that would be an
That's
outstanding.
that is. I will talk to the Times about that idea and see. Maybe we can do a
A
Tucker
Time
Carlson
slash
Media,
Tucker
New York
Carlson
Times,
network
UFO. I
collab.
think that no, I think that could be that could sort of define American media for the 21st century. Um, yeah, but yeah, so it's sort of C.S. Lewis wrote a book called Mere Christianity, right?
Yes,
And that was
but he
written at
was
a
a
time
Protestant,
he was a
so
Protestant, but that was written at a time when Christianity was, to him, it seemed much weaker than it had been in
right.
the past. But to us, Christianity at the time he wrote that seemed
Yes,
much more culturally potent, certainly institutional Christianity. So there is a way in which what I'm doing here is sort of mere religion, right? But
yes,
which is again a sign of how far we've fallen even from Lewis's point. But I
yes.
also
Good
think
point.
that there is I'm trying to get a certain kind of reader to accept or entertain a set of premises that are actually sort of more radical given their presuppositions than the further steps into the specific dogmatic claims of my own church. And I think that's enough for this book. Again, it ends with some pro-Christian propaganda, but I think it would be enough to convince someone that the things that the big religions are arguing about are really important to argue about, because the things the big religions have in common in their beliefs are broadly true.
Okay, so those things are life after death, the supernatural.
The universe is a created thing. The universe was created for a purpose. We human beings, conscious life, have some very important role to play in that purpose. The universe is not just a big cosmic randomness. I mean, I'm arguing against, in part, the sort of default assumption that um, that the perspective of modern science has revealed human beings' insignificance. I am specifically arguing that,
Right.
in fact, the combination of what we know about the fine tuning of the universe and the role of human consciousness, its ability to understand the universe, and so
Right.
on, all point to a central role for human beings, even if we are on a small planet in a vast galaxy. That's not the only indicator of relevance and centrality. I think we have pretty strong indicators. And then I'm arguing with Hume, among others, about how we should think about supernaturalism and the plausibility of the
Hate
supernatural.
that guy.
I think we've learned a lot, though, since the 18th century about where religious experience, spiritual experience, where it comes from, right? If you go back and read Hume, there's this sort of assumption that, okay, yes, there are religious experiences, people have them, but really most people believe in the miraculous and the numinous because their priest told them to, because there's some cultural accretion of myths and legends.
It's a very English book.
It's a very English book, but it's a very late 18th century book. It's like, okay,
Yes,
we've
yes.
lived under the rule of priests for so long. Now we're getting out from under that rule. And once we do, people will stop believing in the supernatural. And that's just not, now we have 200 years of data since then that shows
Any
that
day now. Any day
you
now.
can, well, you're right. You don't, the reason that people believe in the supernatural is that people have supernatural experiences and they keep on having them even if they aren't living in a medieval Catholic village where they're taught to
Even if they
believe.
themselves believe that such experiences are not possible.
Even then, yes.
Yes. All right. I mean, I approve of the book, and I when it's out, I will tell everyone I know, all of my whatever 1,000 followers on Twitter, my 12 best friends
The
to buy it.
important, well, I think the hope, the commercial hope, right, is that it becomes a book that nice Christian grandmothers buy for their surly teenage grandchildren just before they go off to a godless university in the hopes of keeping them religious. If
Right.
it's a big bestseller, that's the key,
That's the key
demographic
demo.
I'm going for. Yes.
Well, boomers are dominating. They're going to keep ruling us forever. So they're also the book market. They're the TV market. They're the
They're
voting market.
undoubtedly keeping the print book market alive, and
They're
all
they're
authors will be sorry when the boomers are gone.
That's true. All right, next book.
Yes.
I'm running a commercial show here, Douthat. We have a schedule, all right? So, uh, n- okay, so it's called The Falcon's Children. It's on Substack. Uh, it's
So
very well written.
less a book, one might say, than an experiment. Yes.
Well, I mean, serial publishing of books has a great tradition. Like all of Balzac's oeuvre was serially published, and many other great writers.
Hmm. Yes,
It
no, I am much like Balzac and Dickens. I am the yeah. So this is an experiment. This is a novel. It's a fantasy novel. It is like all proper fantasy novels, the first book of a trilogy. I'm not writing it and publishing it. I had already written it, so I'm honing it and putting chapters out into the world. And I would like to say that it is that I am pioneering a new form of commercial publishing that will revolutionize the publishing industry. But the reality is that I would have happily published this with a major fantasy publisher, and they declined. So here we are, right? And it's fun. I mean, the truth is that as having labored in the vineyards of opinion journalism in your own way for many years, it is really nice to do kinds of writing that are not just
right,
focused on
right.
policy, as important as policy is, which is why everyone should subscribe to Policy Sphere. But um, but yeah, I'm enjoying the experiment. I don't have any intense expectations for what it will become. Although I do have to decide actually, based on interest, subscriptions, these kinds of things, whether I could just have enough of a readership base to go ahead and write the sequel immediately.
Well, you have
That
to
is one
now
of the
because
well,
otherwise,
otherwise I'm George R. Martin. No, I know, but
exactly.
I
Be
think
Balzac. Don't be
yes,
don't be George Martin. Be
right.
Balzac.
But the truth is that I have 5 children and various professional obligations, and it's easier to go ahead and write the next book if you have at least
If there's a
a
financial incentive,
thousand
they get
paying
it. Yes,
subscribers clamoring to read it.
yes, yes.
Um,
So
but and the French, and then it has to be translated. What would it be? It'd be Les Enfants de Falcon. What is Falcon? Falcon?
Faucon,
Falcon? Faucon.
les enfants du
Les
faucon.
Enfants de Faucon. Right. So it
Yes,
has to be translated en français. Um, as well.
Well, of course, it's the language of civilization, so that goes. Otherwise, it's not real. So I should say I've read the first three chapters. I believe I want to read the others. I think I've really enjoyed it. I want to read the rest just because I like it and not because. Can you give me a moment? Ugh. There will be editing. My dog is. All right. I was just saying before my beautiful dog started acting out. I was just saying that I really enjoyed uh, reading the book, which is relevant for several reasons. First of all, I don't like fantasy as a genre. So, I wouldn't say that if I didn't really, really like it. It's infuriating because you're already the best prose writer I know in nonfiction, so it's really infuriating to find out that you're also an excellent prose stylist in fiction and narrative fiction, which is different. So that's it's just
But surely it's on Substack, Pascal. So that can you can temper your
well, no,
fury
but
at
as
my
a as a as a
all around excellence with that knowledge.
well, no, as an appreciator of the craft and as a occasional craftsman myself, it's very, very frustrating. Um, I guess the reason why I'm interested in talking about the novel is why is it that attracted you to fantasy as a genre, and why are there so many conservatives writing fantasy books in their spare time? Because you're not the only one, and I think you're not the only one.
I mean, I think the second question is easy to answer. That fantasy is a genre that is set in a imagined past that tends to be occupied with sort of the transitions back and forth between modernity and pre-modernity, between enchantment and disenchantment. Those are all, I think, generally interesting topics, which is why part of why I'm interested in them. But they're obviously of special interest to conservatives, right? The running joke that all young conservatives are either radicalized by the fantasy novels of J.R.R. Tolkien or the fantasy novels of Ayn Rand, right? Is there's profound truth to that. I always find it in a way more interesting that fantasy has so many left wing and progressive fans. I think if
This
you
is
look
true. Yeah.
if you look both around the broad landscape of um, American culture, but also just if you wander through. Are there Renaissance fairs in France? By the way, I know that there's like the theme park in somewhere in La France profonde that has
Yeah,
sort of
they're du
jousting
fou.
and right. But
Yeah,
are
yeah,
there Renaissance fairs? Is there a French
yeah.
equivalent to that American custom?
I mean, I'm sure there must be. We had.
I guess you just have fairs. Right? There's no need to pretend. It's like farmers bringing their goods to market somewhere
Yes, we have
south of
actual
Lyon.
fairs. So my I can talk about this because, as you know, my mother is now a public figure as a member
Yes.
of the French National Assembly, and like one of the reasons she became locally famous is because she would do events and fairs to promote like local agricultural produce and things of that nature. And the last one she hired, I mean, not hired, but brought a group of Gaulish reenactors to like recreate a Gaulish village off to the side of the fair between the parking lot and the
So this is like Asterix and Obelix kind
yes,
of like
yes, but
okay, yes.
they're real, they're real everyday people, and what they do on the weekends is they reenact period accurate Gaulish village life, and I didn't know they existed. Once I found out, I was over the moon. They're very careful about doing things in a historically accurate way. The women weave, the men forge, and so presumably there are also medieval, Renaissance, early modern.
Right.
I wouldn't be surprised at all if there was
Presumably,
imperial,
yes.
if there were people reenacting, hussar charges and Austerlitz. So
Right. Well, right. The Napoleonic. I mean, yeah, I would assume that there's amazing Napoleonic reenactments of some kind. That it can't just be, can't just be American. But my point was, if you go to an American Renaissance fair, and there's one in northeastern Connecticut, the state, the American state where we live, which we've taken our kids to on several occasions. And you look around the crowd there, it's not a crowd that I would assume is breaking hard for Republican presidential candidates, right? So
they're
that
not National Review and First Thing
they're not
subscribers,
right. So that in a way is the thing to be explained, not why
right?
there are a lot of conservative writers who secretly would like to imitate J.R.R. Tolkien, but why there is this the breadth of the appeal of fantasy, but also sort of the particular appeal to people who have politics quite different from Tolkien. Now, if you go back to the 1960s, the hippies loved Tolkien, right? There was a whole,
Sure.
Led Zeppelin sort of back to the land. Like there's ways in which environmentalism clearly fits in
And the
quite.
hippies are MAGA now, so
Right, the hippies are MAGA. Yeah, so
all
so
it all
probably I'm going to go back to the Renaissance fair, and it's going to be all, make
RFK fans
right, make Aragon great again. Right, make I
make
should say
Numenor great again.
make Aquitaine great again. Right, no, make Numenor great again. Well, they did that a little bit in the terrible Amazon Tolkien adaptation, where they were trying to portray the internal politics of Numenor, and they had, aggrieved workers
Yes,
complaining about like elves undercutting their wages or something like that. So,
I
be
saw that
careful what you
clip.
wish
Yes,
for. But yeah, I think fantasy, in a way, if you wanted to push things a bit further, you could say that the two books that you're asking me about do share a similar preoccupation, in that I think that the um, religion and religious arguments are interesting. They're always interesting, but they're especially interesting right now because you do have a sense of sort of, the kind of secular um, sort of plastic sheen over the world cracking up in all kinds of ways, and weirder things are sort of creeping back into Western life, for good and ill. It's definitely not all good, but so fantasy is a genre that is preoccupied with those kind of issues and moments, like, is magic still here? Can magic return? Right? Like, what is the line between the modern and the pre-modern, the enchanted and the disenchanted? So in that way, writing about religion and writing a fantasy novel where, the realm of fairy is sort of breaking into a more prosaic medieval reality, they're sort of the same book, maybe. in the end, I don't know.
no, well, yeah, okay.
Not they're not the same book, and I'm not writing an allegory for the Trump era by any stretch of the imagination. But I think there are connections between the cultural landscape that we're heading into in the Western world, which I think will be weirder and in certain ways more
Yeah,
supernaturalist, and the preoccupations of the fantasy genre, definitely.
I mean, so I'm just sort of like being. I mean, I don't know if devil's advocate is the right phrase, but um, you could equally argue that, I don't know. This is just me, just not liking fantasy as a genre. Like I liked and read The Lord of the Rings, and that's it. And I'm also enjoying yours, mostly because it's very well written, and I want to know what happens next. Um, I,
But go on. Yes, yes.
you could write historical fiction, or you could argue that conservatism is uh, belief in right reason, belief in an ordered cosmos, and that woo woo stuff
Right.
seen broadly is the domain of the cultural left. I mean, that's not very true in this current cultural moment. Um,
So, right. So, my belief is that my personal belief is that woo woo and the supernatural is only really interesting and credible if it belongs to a some kind of ordered cosmos. Not that the order is something that is going to be completely accessible to us, right? By
right,
its nature, the supernatural order is not accessible to us in the way the natural order is through scientific investigation. Um, but I am against the conceit that says to be religious, to be supernaturalist, to believe in spiritual realities is to set empiricism aside and to
right.
just sort of embrace vibes, to go back to where we started, feelings, woo woo sentiments. I think that,
Did you think fantasy was just vibes? Well,
the
no, it's
fantasy,
not.
it's not just vibes. Well, no, this is why Tolkien casts such a long shadow over the genre, right? Is precisely
Right,
that he was a philologist. He was, a
right,
systematizer, a
right,
creator of
right.
languages, on a
He
scale that,
built the entire universe before adding the stories and the characters, and so it feels profoundly
yes,
not just real but ordered.
ordered. Yes, and that is something
Um,
that I think different fantasy writers wrestle with. It's really hard to match Tolkien in world building. You
yes,
can rebel against. You could argue that one of the, and people have argued this. Right wing critics of George R. R. Martin have argued that one reason Martin has been unable to finish A Song of Ice and Fire, the saga that's the basis for Game of Thrones, is that he wanted to rebel against Tolkien in certain ways by rejecting the sort of, fundamentally Christian
yeah,
vision of the
yeah,
cosmos that Tolkien had. But then, having done that, he had no way to actually end his own saga because he was still working with the same basic ideas. He still had, for all the shades of gray and blood and sex and gore in Martin's books, you still have good guys and bad guys. You still
right,
have a supernatural enemy lurking in the frozen north, right?
right.
And again, I don't think this is the only reason he can't finish the series, but I think there is
Maybe
sort of a
also because
problem
he's
of
extremely rich.
he's extremely rich. He lives in the Southwest, which deadens. I think it's where great artists go when they've finished doing their best work. D.H. Lawrence, Cormac McCarthy, all these people.
You have to
No,
be
I don't
in
know.
haunted
That's
New
just something
England.
someone said on Twitter. I don't know if it's true. I don't want to cast aspersions on New Mexico, but he's yeah, he wants to do subversion of the kind of order that Tolkien had, but he can't figure out how to do that and still land the plane, right?
Right,
Bring the saga to a conclusion.
right.
So in that sense, I would be, and again, this applies to both fantasy novels and to religion. I am a defender of the idea that if something is real, even if it's not fully comprehensible by human beings under our current limited conditions, it does have to make sense.
Right.
And this is similar, my other recent book that I wrote about my struggles with Lyme disease and chronic illness and so on, also had that sort of theory running through it, right? That I wandered into some really strange territory trying to get better from this illness. But even while I was wandering in that strange territory, I did still want the weird things I was doing to make sense. Like if some
Yeah.
alternative medicine worked, I wanted to know why it worked. And I thought, even if I couldn't fully understand it, because who can master the intricacies of your own immune system, the idea that it should make sense, that it shouldn't just be woo and vibes and so on, is important to me, I think.
Yes. I mean, you are a writer of the overlap between the natural and the supernatural. I think that's fair to say. I think that's a theme running through your entire writing. So in that sense, it makes sense why you would write a fantasy novel. I'm just curious about the, you know, the, I mean, maybe this is just me being an ornery old man, which is my privilege as a conservative to just be ornery about certain things. But you look so to bounce off what you were saying about Martin, like one of the great inspirations for his work was the series The Accursed Kings by Maurice
Yes.
Buell, who was himself a conservative, um, and a hero of Free France. And the books are historical novels. They're novelized tellings of actual real world historical events in 14th century France. And well, if they have also their share of like sex and Machiavellian intrigue. Hello. And this is authenticity. We're bringing authenticity into the podcast. Yes, hello. Um, and all of that, and it ends in a satisfying way because the ending is in the history books. Um,
Right. Well, so I think you can argue this both ways, but I think clearly part of the appeal of fantasy, not the supernatural part, but just the Machiavellian part that Martin does in Game of Thrones, is
right,
having that kind of story without one, with the author having a little more freedom because you get to make up what happened, and
right,
also with the
right.
reader having a little less knowledge. Like people love novels, about Anne Boleyn and Henry VIII, and
Right.
every time I wander into a bookstore, there's 6 new novels about the Tudors and
Yeah.
their intrigues and so on. But in the end, like we know who died, who was beheaded. You can cheat a
Right.
little and have some. You can write alternate history too. I guess I think an open question is, is there more fundamentally? Is there more creativity in inventing your own version of the medieval world where it's sort of open ended and there's more narrative possibilities, or is that just sort of a form of laziness masquerading as creativity, and in fact the greater artists are the ones who accept some boundaries set by what actually happened in the world and tell their stories within them. And again, I like fantasy, so I'll defend the creativity involved, but it is also the case that the fact that Martin couldn't end his saga is not a big advertisement for that approach. And I think that there is definitely a way in which not only Martin, but a number of the most successful contemporary fantasists have tended to get lost inside their
Right.
worlds. And Robert Jordan, who was a best-selling fantasy author I read as a teenager, he didn't have writer's block like Martin. He kept writing more books, and his world kept sprawling more and more, and
Right.
then he got cancer and died, and the books had to be finished by Brandon Sanderson, who is now himself a best-selling fantasy author. But that was a case study where the first 4 or 5 books of Martin's saga, of Robert Jordan's saga, were terrific, and then you got to like book 10 or 11, and you were like, well, is this ever going to end?
Right.
There's a writer who I don't particularly like, but who wrote 2. Um, what are those? See, I'm even blanking on the name. Anyway, there are other fantasy novelists currently hanging around who have some big unfinished sagas, and then you have examples where they were finished and they just weren't very good in the end. And
Yeah.
so I think you could certainly fold that pattern into a version of your grouchy historical realist critique, right? And say, I think you could frame it this way. You could say, yes, there are some big narrative possibilities available to
Right.
fantasy novelists that aren't available to historical novelists. And at their best, you can do some really impressive things in that zone. But the temptation to never, to never finish, that
Right.
is a real one. And sometimes you're better off just knowing that, okay, by 1570, the Reformation has to have started, right? Like you have historical
Right.
fiction imposes on
Right.
you, and limits, as conservatives all know, are good for creativity.
Indeed. Well, I guess we have to end here, as your
Well, I
time is
think
very precious.
it's precious, but we've really covered, we've covered
We've
everything,
covered
right?
everything. Like,
The
there's
past and
no
future of the Republican Party. What do you
yes.
think? Wait, no, Pascal, what do you think is going to happen? We'll end with me interviewing you for a moment.
Okay.
What do you think the policy agenda of the second Trump administration and the Republican Party is going to be?
I think that um, I think there's going to be some, if gun to my head, forecasting. I think there's going to be some deportation of like the worst criminal elements, but it's not going to go further. Um, I think the tax bill will mostly be bad. I think they're going to bring back salt. I what I'm most
Good for those of us in Connecticut. It must be said. This is my,
I mean
it's a
that's the
win-win with
priority.
salt.
We need to get the Connecticut voters. That's what really matters. Um, and what I am interested in and hopeful on is trade policy and administrative state reform. And I think the people working on that are good. I think the appetite and the sort of political capital for it is strong enough that I think probably something is going to happen. I don't know exactly what. Which is, you have to subscribe to Policy Sphere to find out, as I
You do.
do from
You do.
my exclusive sources. But there you go. That's my answer to your question.
Okay.
Very, very unprepared and
Sounds good, because
very.
you're talking to, Vice President Vance every day. So I rely on you to know what is coming. If not now, then certainly 4 years from now.
And not just him.
No,
I
not
have
no, no. I
many
mean,
sources in
you're
Capitol
also
Hill
talking
and the
to
government.
RFK Jr. every day. Policy Sphere is brought to you. It's brought to you by.
Well, I
Um,
mean, he could certainly, like. I mean, if you wanted to to give Maha a kind of substance, I think that copying France would actually be like pretty good on a lot of agricultural and like food regulation stuff. Would actually be like a pretty good guideline.
yes. No. I mean, that was always the destiny. American populism would end with a Kennedy implementing
With a
French
Kennedy
agricultural
making
policy.
America
I mean,
like
this
France.
is one of the this is the fundamental reality of not just American, but certainly American politics over the last 15 or 20 years are surprises that require you to be amused to some degree by them, I think, in order to
And to
just
believe in the supernatural.
and to believe that Providence is steering all of this for the amusement of the thrones and dominions high up in the angelic choir. So, anyway, Pascal, this has been a pleasure. Thank you
With
so much
that,
for having me.
thank you very much for doing this, and happy Thanksgiving. Since
Oh,
this is being recorded
just before. That's
just
right.
before Thanksgiving, although it's going to air in a couple weeks. But yeah, thank you very much for doing this.
It was my pleasure. Talk to you soon.